about content providers then next. So remember we talked about this on Monday. We basically said, you know, one of the main building blocks is this thing called a content provider, and basically what it is, it's a way to share data between two apps, right? It's essentially your CRUD interface, right? Whenever you deal with data, there are 4 and only 4 things you can do to a data: create, retrieve, update, and delete, right? CRUD. So that nicely translates into insert, update, delete, and query, right? Those are your 4 things. So there's such thing as content provider, which allows us to basically do this thing with data to access it from another app. I mentioned that the system uses content providers quite a bit internally as well. We mentioned contacts, for example, media store, settings, etc. Like if I show you on a file, on the app list, let me close everything here actually. If I show you here in the file explorer, notice that data. Notice that your contacts app, for instance, doesn't have any data. There's basically no data under contacts, right? It's empty. But if you go under providers contacts, that's where the data is, right? So that's your people are right here. Make sense? So we're separating concerns, right? That's the idea behind content providers. So and this is just an example. So we mentioned this in this context, for example. So we said what you really have in the system. Why did I go to that slide? No, hold on a second. That's where we're. What goes on in the system is that you have a UI app, right? This is your application that represents your UI, and then you have another app that represents your data, right? So basically, a content provider is accessing the data and then exposing it to whoever needs to access it. Now, what this allows for is for other components to easily access your data as well. So for example, somebody wanted to write a nicer looking address book like HTC does. They have a sexier address book, right? They can just write a new UI, then it's going to tap into the same database, data source, right? So you don't have to have multiple data sources out there. You can just have one. Okay. So that's the motivation for content providers. So far, so good. So let's create a content provider. So to create a content provider, it's just like other main building blocks, right? So you are going to start by creating a new class. So in Yamba, we're going to create a new class. Well, let me explain why we're adding it to Yamba first, other than, you know, something to show you. But the real need for this was that we wanted to at some point be able to create a widget, right? Something that sits on a home screen. Well, that runs in a separate process altogether. So for that to be able to access your data, we need to expose the data via the content provider. So that's the motivation. Okay. Otherwise, nobody outside our app can access the data, and we actually want tweets to be available. Okay. So to do that, we're going to create a new class, so new Android class, and I'm going to call it status provider. Okay, so just like before, you need to extend provider, content provider, sorry, not provider, content provider, organize imports, and you need to then add an implemented methods There's a whole bunch. Okay.
So under the provider, there's content provider and there's a service provider.
We care about content provider.
But what are the providers besides content?
What do you mean under? Where under where?
So wasn't provider like triple class?
No. You're talking about the package. You're probably referring to this in DDMS. You're talking about this, right? Provider, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. No, this is just a package name. So it's a standard practice in Android to name a content provider, call Android providers, and then this is a content provider, second content provider, third content provider, and so on and so on. Yeah. It's a naming convention. And you can see some of the built-in ones, right? Applications, calendar, contacts, downloads, DRM, media, settings, telephony, user direct dictionary, and so on and so on.
So anything under media would be available to other apps as well.
Yeah, that's how it's stored. Now, keep in mind that media doesn't media is really just a meta information about your media. Your actual images are still going to be in an SD card, but the content provider is going to know where they are and so on, query them, identify them, and so on.
So big picture wise, really, if you need confidential information, you will not select content provider in the first place. So I have to not have that.
Yeah, probably. I mean, you can set permissions on content providers if it's about confidential information, right? You can set permissions and so on. But the first thing, the content provider is designed for sharing data. Now you may say, I only want to share data with allies, right, or friends, right? Then you would use permissions to manage that. And you can set permissions for read, write, and so on and so on. Cool. So now that we got this file with gazillion things in it, what we want, I'm just gonna reorganize it so that, for example, on create is first, followed by all the other methods. So on create kind of makes sense. Like insert, update, delete, and query, I would kind of organize them to be in that order, right? Insert, update, delete. Update, delete, and query. It just this order sort of doesn't lend itself well, so that's why I'm just gonna insert, update, delete, query. Right? That's sort of how I think about it. And then we have on create and on get type. So this would be your template, right? And did I actually do this one in your templates? Do we have provider? Oh, we do. There's a content provider and there's a template for content provider. Ta-da! So you got it, right? What it does, right? So all the steps that I'm talking about are right here, step by step, right? So that's the content provider, and what we need to do is we need to fill in the blanks. This is our what it does, right? So basically, what we're gonna have is we're gonna define a content. So every content provider must have a content URI. This is what it's gonna respond to, right? You usually define it as a constant. It's usually a public static final string. URI. Content URI. Organize imports. Now, to get a URI, you're usually going to do something like this: URI.parse and then some kind of string. Okay. Now, what I typically do is I define what goes in here. We usually call authority, right? So I usually define that also as a constant. It's not necessary, but I find it a little cleaner. This one is necessary, content URI. It's pretty typical, actually. It's more of a convention than a law. So far good. So what we do under what authority should look like is something like this. Let me point you to the official like dev guide on content providers, because there's a nice little picture. Content providers, and then toward the bottom there's a little picture. This is what your typical authority looks like. It looks like this, right? Content, blah 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 blah. Okay. Now let's focus. Let's figure out what is what. So this is sort of written in stone. This part A, there's really not much to think about it. It's always like that. Content column / right? Part B is usually going to be something that identifies your app, right? So this should usually be something like the reverse of a domain name or something like that, right? So for us, it would be column example Yamba. Yamba status provider, for example. That would be a good one. Then these are optional, right? This is C is optional. The path the content provider to determine what kind of data is being requested. It could be just a slash. It could be 0 or more elements, right? So we could have /status /public or /status /friends /timeline /friends. It's up to you, right? Essentially, and I'll get back to it essentially in a second. And the final one is also totally optional. If present, it identifies a single record. If not present, it identifies all records, right? So a content provider URI could be pointing to a single record or many records, right? Mostly all, right? So, but the authority is going to be basically this part here. I usually add this to it as well. So basically, it would be HTTP : content : com dot example dot yamba dot status yamba dot provider dot status, or I can just say dot provider. That's good, right? So that is a good way to kind of do it. So what we can then do, parse that, and that's gonna give us our content URI. Yeah.
The policy URI, which sounds like it could be general, but in the documentation it said that the first part always needs to be content colon /. You never make a link so that we know that HTTP service is included in content provider.
Yeah. No. Yeah, I'll just put it up. No, you cannot access content URI over HTTP. No. Content provider only responds to content column / type of thing, right? It can serve any type of content, but which will be defined by the type. But it's only designed for this specific protocol. It's something that's proprietary to Android.
If you're running some HTTP server locally,
if you're running HTTP server locally, can you wrap it on a content provider? So back to design diagram. Content provider is is just an interface to a data. Now it doesn't have to be that this data is a database. It could actually be that there's a cloud and that your content provider is merely going straight to the cloud. So that's also the possibility. Like for example, another way to design Yamba would be to basically have forget about querying the database, forget about inserting the database, but go directly into content provider, go directly from content provider, and not worry how content provider is getting the data. Maybe content provider is actually getting the data directly from here, right? So that would be another approach. I think one of my design graphs that I showed you at one point was doing something like that. So if I do Yamba doc out L up open Yamba PDF. So this was one design where all the access to data was done through a content provider. So we didn't really care how content provider was getting the data. So right, our timeline activity was just getting it from here, right? And it could have that it gone this way. It could have that it gone this way, right? It doesn't. It's not important. So what's backing content provider is not that important, but it usually is a database. Yeah, but it could be a file and so on. Could be some kind of logic. All right, so far so good on this. Yeah, so we're just creating a content provider. Now to a couple other things in onCreate. onCreate is your standard onCreate. If it was successfully created, you would want to return true. Right, so that means yeah, we have created, right? It's created. And now let's talk about a couple of these methods. So get type is supposed to return a MIME type. So let me show you my documentation. So what this get type is supposed to do is return the MIME type of the document that it returns. So it returns the MIME type of the given URI. Typically, the MIME type will either be something like this. So it's either going to be something like this or something like this. Basically, the only difference being that you're either going to say I'm returning one item or I'm returning an entire directory, right? So now to do this, you gotta figure out what is the URI, because it says get type for the URI, right? So basically what we would need to do here is we would need to figure out, what is the that. And to figure that out, you would need to do URI dot not authority, but get last path segment, I believe. I believe you wanna basically check. In this case, get a path and then figure out if the path is. Let me see what I did in this case. You wanna get type system. So basically, you want to figure out what is the type of that URI that was. So for example, I could say URI dot get path. So the decoded path or null if this is not path segment. It's not a path. Get last. Either way, we can basically just ignore it. for our purpose. So get last path segments. Was that the one? Get the decoded last segment in the path, decoded last segment, or now if the path is empty. I believe that's the one. So, for example, if if the last path segment, and remember the path refers to that, right? So this will be the last path, the D, right? The record. Right. So basically, if that segment is null, right, then I would return, for example, one authority. If it's not null, I would return another, right? So basically, and now that's your return type that you would want to return. And those things look like this. So basically, single record would be something like that. Oops. But if you're too lazy to type this one, you can ignore it. So the difference is that if it's null, we return an item. If it's not, we would return a dir. And in our case, it would basically be, we said example, and then I think Yamba status, right? Something like that. So what we are doing here is we're making up a a MIME type, yeah, MIME type, yeah.
So, and this is all internal. This is all internal within the app.
Yes,
this is MIME types are normally registered on server and stuff, right? But
yeah, no, this is all internal, yeah, within the app. So that's why it's not really actually important to us in this case at all. This would all work fine if you just return null as well. So you don't really need to worry about it too much.
What would we call it? What's an example of something that's going to call the pipeline?
So it's basically part of the system. So basically, even to handle requests to the MIME type of the data as the given URI, the return MIME type should be blah or blah multiple, and this method can be called from multiple threads. So that's if you are trying to figure out what kind of information a specific content provider is providing. That's kind of like almost for querying content providers. Like I'm not sure if Facebook people provider returns names or pictures or something like that, right? So I could then say, hey, Facebook people provider, what do you provide? That's essentially what it is. So you can get a MIME type and then handle it. So you can do some interesting querying on the system in real time.
if you're publishing your own resources,
Yeah.
then maybe
Yeah.
Yeah.
But in our case, like I said, I mean, to all honesty, like if you're lazy, you can just return null, and it's all gonna be fine, right? But I guess you can also return something like that. Now, are you guys good so far? Now let's talk about insert. So insert does the following: inserts values, right, into that URI, right? So this is basically now calling database and then database and insert, right? So what we could do is we could use our status data to basically do this. We already have DB helper, right, in status data. So remember in status data we basically had our DB helper and we had a database. So insert is actually very similar to this, except it already does this, right? So we just need to do that, right? Make sense? So you can copy, if you want, you can copy paste that. Okay. So we could copy paste this into that code, or we can have this guy then later on just call the content provider. So later on we can simplify this guy to or move the DB helper altogether to content provider. But for now, so make the DB helper. It's already private to the package. So I'm gonna define in onCreate. Here I'm gonna define SQLite database DB, right? And DB helper, right? And then what we can do in onCreate, for instance, is we can just initialize those variables. So DB helper is gonna be Yamba app, right? Get. Ooh, we don't have get application. Hold on. So it may make sense to do some refactoring at this point because DB helper may make more sense now in the context of the status provider, right? And then status data could actually be using that. Makes sense?
Why don't you set a status provider instantiate a status data
So we could do that as well. So basically, you're saying to make this guy be a status provider, content provider.
Yeah, just do a wrapper. I'm gonna figure out that
It's totally fine. It's more that would totally work. The only reason why I'm thinking against that is just that I would complicate this file quite a bit. So I'm trying to keep the file somewhat manageable in size. So we could do that. We could also do this. So we have the context. We could actually create a new DB helper for now. I'll just do them in parallel. So I'll say DB helper. I can say something like this: new DB helper. Get context. Whoa, what just happened? Oh no.
In the Yamba app, you could.
Sorry, I wanted to make it do it here. So I'm gonna take the status DB helper out of this guy. So basically, I'm gonna do this. I'm gonna close, as opposed to being an inner class, I'll close this, right? I'm gonna basically reformat. Now DB helper is a class on its own, right? And I just need to fix this to say status data dot. Okay, because now it doesn't know about the variables. That's not a big deal. So just add status data to all these red underlines. I guess I can define private static final string tag. Okay, so now that I have status data, I could, this also compiles db helper. You guys get what I just did? So I took, because we now need db helper to be accessible in the content provider. It actually should be moved there eventually, but just to kind of decouple it from status data, what I did is I took it out, so it's not an inner class anymore, okay? And that just meant I had to pass the context in, and I had to fix a couple of references, right, for things that were underlined red. Okay? So what I did, so that's what we did. So I basically added the constructor, fixed a couple of references there, and then in terms of up, we need to pass the context in. Before I was kind of depending on the fact that it's all tied in and so on and so on. But now I kind of exposed it, yanked it out of, decoupled it from status data. It's still in status data file, but it's not otherwise tied to, it could live in its own file if we chose to, right? As a matter of fact, you want to do that? Would that make more sense to put in a separate file, db helper?
No,
not for now.
But how do you still get the context when you still just provide a file?
Pass it in, get context, and pass it in. Right. So far so good. So everyone now on the same page? Yeah. Things compile. Only 2 files we're touching so far. So how do you write insert? Well, insert, so you're gonna get 2 things here, right? You're gonna get the URI and you're gonna get the insert values. The values are gonna be what you insert into the database. So we're gonna be opening the database. So somewhere we're gonna say db is gonna be db helper dot get writable database, right? So we get a database, and then we're gonna say db dot insert with on conflict, right? And then we're gonna do the actual right. So then we're gonna do the actual insert, right? So status data dot table, right? Null column hack, we said it's a null, right? Initial values is gonna be the values, right? And conflict algorithm is gonna be ignore. So it's gonna be, what was the SQLite database conflict ignore, right? So that one. I mean, you could copy paste this line, but yeah. Right? So basically this here, okay, is identical to this here, right? well, if it's identical, then why is this stuff here in the first place? Why is the DB? Can we get rid of this? I mean, now we got duplicate code, right? 2 lines of code, same as these 2 lines of code, right? So we could get rid of it here, right? So I could get rid of it here, and to do that, and then but I have values. So how do I now call the content resolver? Call the content provider, right? So now you have a content provider providing insert. You just need to pass it the values. We got the values, right? So that we build these values. So how do we now insert? So you can do something like this: get context dot get content resolver dot insert, right? So we have the context, and we can now say insert into this URI, right? Now the URI itself is going to be that constant, right? So it's going to be status provider dot content values, content URI, and that's going to be the URI, right? So this now calls that, right? So our content provider has an insert statement. Okay, our data now calls get content resolver and says insert. Now what's going to happen is, based on this URI, it's somehow magically going to get resolved to that content provider, right? So far so good. So you can kind of see how it's kind of convenient, because content provider is really just kind of like a query, just kind of like a proxy to a database almost, right?
Lazy initializing the provider for conceptually.
Yeah, yeah.
So in this case, they're both running in the same thread, right?
Yeah, they are running in the same thread. Yeah.
In case there some other process asks for the content, and if you're busy making content for previous customer, what happens then?
Yeah, you're supposed to. Yeah. So good question. So a question about threads, and this is now getting into the territory of like some changes that are new. So up until recently, it was the best practice to do something like this on a separate thread, right? But you would have to kind of worry about it yourself, and it was just a best practice. Since API 11, Honeycomb, this became a law, because they made strict mode be the default mode. But to support it, they created something called content loaders. So we can look into that later on. We can bring, once we have this content provider done, we can actually bring it back to our, make it work. So we'll get to that. Okay, so we now, that's gonna create the values, right? And then it's gonna simply say get resolver and then insert, right? Now on the here, there's one thing that's kind of missing. What the heck is this null, right? So in theory, what we're supposed to do is, and again, this is just how it's all. Remember, it's an interface, so there's certain kind of rules we should adhere to. If we don't, sometimes it's okay, but it's like, to button everything up, the proper way would be to return this URI plus the ID of what was inserted. So this actually returns an ID of what was inserted, right? So it's gonna return long, and it's gonna return ID or -1 if any error. And here we're supposed to return the URI of a newly created item, right? So basically, we should do something like this. Long ID is going to be that, right? So I should now return so if I would say if ID is not -1, I would return URI dot with appended path. No, it's like so it's actually URI and path segment is gonna be long. It's gonna be ID. So hold on. So something like this. Can I do that? I can't do that. Damn. I was hoping. Something like that. Else, I'm gonna return URI. Okay. Make sense? Or I mean, maybe it's cleaner this way. Return URI and then URI equals. So if ID is not -1, we append it, and then we return that URI. Okay. So that's to kind of like be proper, right? So far so good. On create, just basically creates a new DB helper and returns true. Okay, so by the same token, let's do the other one that's kind of complex, and that's the query, right? So query is gonna do the query, right? So we need to basically immutable blah blah blah. No, not that. So query implements this to handle query requested from a client. Blah blah. Example query calls managed query. And so on. So what we need to do a query is we need what we already have here in status data. Get readable database, get a cursor, return a cursor. You can basically copy what you did before and paste it here for the most part. Right? Now, this query, DB query, we passed in a bunch of nulls. We're not going to do that this time around. But DB query basically had, so first one was table, second one was columns, okay? Then it was selection args. So columns is actually projections. So this would go here, right? This would go here, this would go here, right? We do not have having and grouping, but we do have a sort order. So we're not gonna hard code it, we're gonna do this, right? So we're basically passing the data that came to the content provider directly to the database. You can kind of see how there's like a nice sort of relationship between the two, right?
So you have to get rid of projection.
Projection is columns. It's basically which columns do you care about, right? So like, you know, select star from status. That would be a projection, would be star, meaning all columns.
It's a little confusing. So what's selection then?
Selection and selection args are the where selection is the actual where statement, the args are the variables into it. So it's so you know, you plug it in the actual numbers. Yeah.
I'm sure it's in the book, but I just.
Yeah. 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 Cool. So now that we have that, we can in our query, as opposed to doing all that, we can basically just say return get content resolver, right, dot query, right, and then status provider content URI, right, and projection was null, selection was null, selection args was null, and sort order was status data dot created that plus space descending. Like that, right? So we basically just forward the call. There's not a lot of value, I guess, in this case.
So since we're now exposing this data, would the reason have to give the status provider some sort of logic?
Yeah, we could add permissions. Yeah, so we can look into that. Let's do that next. So we'll add the permissions for insert, for example. Anyone can read, but not everyone can insert. For example. Presumably, I don't need that, so it can make it a lot shorter. Thank you. Oh, but I need it. What do they? Status right. Yeah, no, yeah, spacing out. Okay. So we've got insert and we've got query. We're gonna leave update and delete for now. Don't care about it too much. What do you want to do about the? What else is missing? What do you think is missing? Manifest file, yeah. So whenever we define a main building block, we gotta define it in the manifest file. So where would it go? To where? Right, so it's going to be equal level citizen to all the other services, receivers, and activities, right? So it's going to be called a provider, So you can go control space provider, right? Control space name dot status provider, and there is a one other thing you need to specify, and that's the authority. Yeah, authorities. Yeah, and authorities are basically it's basically that string that we had. Yeah, yeah, without the dot, so it's gonna be this. This is our authority. Com example Yambo provider, in my case. So that's it. We now registered it. There.
Just to step back a second, so the main reason for doing this is if you want to expose this to the outside world.
That's correct. That's correct. Yeah, there's no good motivation to do this unless you need to expose it. So I created that motivation by saying, hey, at some point we want to create a widget, and a widget lives in a separate process. So something like this is actually necessary. Yeah, yeah.
So could we take the example of specifying a permission here as well for this content provider, and then give that permission to the widget?
Yeah, we can do that.
Could we follow that approach?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we'll do that.
If the widget only needs read information, no write, then can't we use intents to send information back and forth?
If a widget only needs read, not write, can we use intents? I mean, we could, but it's not really how it's designed. Widgets are really designed to read data from a content provider, usually. I mean, but yes, you could. I mean, you could have a widget read from a file system or something crazy like that, but it's not very typical.
Is there any other RPC on Android?
Yes, AIDL. Yeah, there's a binder-based IPC. Yes. Mm-hmm.
How do you contrast the two options? Like, when do we use the other option?
How do you contrast the options? So basically, yeah, content providers are designed for exchanging data. IPCs are more for blocking calls, right? So they serve different purpose. You know, so but there's there's enough gray area in there to have cases that could fit in both. So permissions, you guys were asking. Well, let's first of all check that this works, and then we'll break it further. So let me make sure that this first of all works at all, right? Something's wrong here. All right, so I'm gonna go menu, refresh. Seems to work. Menu, status update, new testing, status provider. Nice. Cool. Everything worked fine. So let me show you something now. Notice that our status data no longer uses the database. as a matter of fact, no longer uses the DB helper. So as such, it doesn't need to create it. Right? So at some point, it doesn't really make sense why DB helper is even here to begin with. Okay? Make sense? So at this point, what I would do is I would cut it out. Okay? And I would move it into status provider as a DB helper. Could even be an inner class. At this point, actually, it could be an inner class because it lives inside of there. Could be an inner class because nobody else really needs it. Right? So my status data is now uber simple little file. It just basically defines high-level stuff, right? As a matter of fact, these two things also are not questionable if this should be. Yeah, that's fine. So it just defines sort of like high-level things like how to do insert of a status, how to do a query of, you know, this, right? So yeah, but that's basically what it does.
How was it different than other apps with no adoption use that content?
How does the other apps know about this? So other apps know about this because we registered it here in the as an authority. So remember, when you install an app, what happens is this gets called the manifest file gets analyzed, and it sees that you have a provider with a certain authority. So when somebody else has resolved this provider, this is how it's found. Okay. Now,
What if the authority already exists in the same way?
what if the authority with the same name already exists? I don't know. That's a problem. It may have then, you know, whatever. Maybe the first one wins or something like that. Now let's keep on thinking about this a little further. Oh, first of all, are you guys all good for now? Okay, let's think about this a little further. I mean, what's really the point of this guy here? Insert doesn't really add a hell of a lot of value. I'm warning you, we're gonna do some refactoring, so some stuff is gonna move around, but it's all in the interest of kind of like, hey, we learned something new. Let's see how we can improve on this. So, so what we can do is we can basically, as a you know, the value here is really just converting status, a Twitter concept, into content, which is an Android concept. So I could actually provide a public, a little helper method, public. I'll call it content values status to values status, right? Take this code, move it down there, right? Return values. Okay, so that's gonna be a little helper. Now, you know, this can now just do, you know, status to values, status, and does the same thing, right? Make sense?
The content values is a built-in class.
Yes, content values is a built-in class. Okay, so far so good. Now my question is, what the heck is the point of having this insert here to begin with? Right? The reason why we hung it here was because we needed some easy way in our other places to basically insert in the database. But what if I let's copy this line. Where are we using this insert? Well, we are using it in actually how do I do this? We're using it in refresh service, right? So refresh service is doing, oh no, yeah, actually we're using it in Yamba. Yamba is doing pull and insert, right? So it's doing the status data insert status here, right? But what if Yamba didn't do that but used actually a content provider? Right? And by the way, we could have made in status status data, we should have made this static, right? Because it doesn't depend on the state. It's just a little helper. It just converts from one data type to another, right? So if I do that, so basically here we use, as opposed to use insert, we now use this content resolver insert, right? But that means I no longer need the insert here. Right? I just moved that code, then remove the word context dot, because now we're is a context as opposed to has a context. Previously we had a has a context, so that's why we had to do context dot to get the resolver. But here it's a is a relationship, so we are inside of a context, so we can just say context, right? What's that? Oh, your status to values. Well, you need to also add this, right? Static status data. Yeah. Yeah. So now status data has that little helper, and it's got this and that, right? So so far so good. What about query? Okay, so query, I'm gonna just copy this line, right? But we were doing that in timeline activity, right? We were doing the query somewhere, right? We're doing it in onCreate, right? Oh, and then we're doing it somewhere else, right? Yeah. In boot receiver, right? So as opposed to doing this like stuff like this, we could actually, we could have done cursor is get content resolver, right? So I'm basically trying to eliminate status data altogether. But then we're going to take some advantages of a content provider when it comes to handling the threading. We're going to get into content loaders, which is somewhat a little advanced stuff. I mean, relatively new stuff. So that's why. So, so we got this here, and then also I got cursor here. I'm going to remove that as well. Okay. So now my status data no longer needs query. Well, it no longer actually needs context because nobody's using it. Right? Actually, the point is nobody even needs to construct status data anymore, right? Because Yamba app could live without status data. We just got rid of status data. Well, almost, right? Yeah.
Did you replace it in the timeline receiver?
Should we go back to the timeline?
Yes. So in timeline receiver, I changed the two. There are two lines where you do cursor equals, right? So, and previously we were getting Yamba app.statusdata.query. Now it's saying content resolver dot query dot blah blah blah. Same thing. Maybe it's not an inner class for you. So if it's not an inner class, it's not gonna know because timeline receiver is not a. You could also try context dot, but I didn't have to do that because it's an inner class. Yeah. So that's where we're at. So we are now no longer. So our status data is really not that necessary anymore. We could actually move all this stuff into status provider if we wanted to, right? Make sense? I mean, we just got a bunch of constants in a one helper file. So you could cut this out, put it into a status provider. What's that? Yeah, we may have to. Actually, Eclipse seems to be smart enough and has adjusted everything, right? Has it? It seems to. It seems like it has. So. Maybe not, but status data. Let's see. Thank you. Thank you. So yeah, so I just did a quick search replace for status data dot replaced with nothing, and everything refactored itself. You just want to make sure everything compiles, and then once you're done with that, you can delete your status data. Well, let me first fix my timeline activity because it seems like it still refers to status data. It's going to be status provider. So let me just replace all BAM fixes it. I just did search replace in timeline, and that fixes it. And then Yamba app, same thing. You can do. There's only one spot, but you can manually changes. So status data became status provider. Pizza is here. Yeah. So let's just finish this, and then I'll let you eat the pizza. For those of you whose code compiles, pizza is that way. Right? For the rest, you gotta stay in here. Yeah. So we so I'm now gonna burn my status data. Gone. So no more pojas. Gonna run to make sure it works, and but keep in mind, you guys, we're not done here. There's more work to be done. It's gonna work, but it's not optimal. There's some nice things that we can now do with content provider, because we can introduce loaders and certain other things like that. So this is just setting up the stage for next, right? So menu, refresh. Yeah, seems to work. Cool.